everybody. Welcome back to another episode of New England Road Talk. I'm Conrad Leger from Environmental Partners, and I'm joined again today by art.baker of Indus and Bobby Betsold of All States Material Group. Guys, how's it going?
Good. Another day here back, and we've kind of turned the tables on Art. You and I got our flannel on, and he's trying to look young and hip in that quarter zip there.
Let's just keep that thing zipped up.
Zipped up as high as it can be. Glad to be back. Looking forward to another episode.
Awesome. Hey, so in previous episodes, we've really kind of focused on pavement preservation and top of the pavement deterioration curve. And today I want to talk a little bit about the bottom of the curve, getting into minor and major rehabilitation and the options that are available there. And, from a pavement management perspective, we all know that every community out there has roads that are in the bottom of the curve, and you can't ignore those roads from a political standpoint and just from a perception standpoint. It'd be great to be able to preserve all your good roads, but a lot of communities are in a situation where they have a lot of bad roads. So why is it important for us to talk about the bottom of the curve, to make sure that there's more than just one or two tools in there, and be able to provide an array of different selections for the right treatment at the right time?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. I mean, again, I think you pointed out we do have bad roads. I think we're always going to have a percentage of bad roads. The ultimate goal is to minimize that percentage. How you minimize that is by spending money at the top of the curve and preventing roads from getting into that condition. But let's face it, we do have those bad roads. And, I think it's important. We're talking about basically, as Conrad pointed out, from the minor rehab down to the major. The minor rehab being, your thin mill and fills and your hot in place. My opinion, there should be an in-between category there for deep mill and fills and cold in place. And that's from a cost standpoint. I get a lot of people who they know mill and fill, they know full depth reclamation, which Bobby will talk about a little bit more in a minute. They don't know about anything in between. And that in between is a new category, in my opinion, that again is that deep mill and fill and cold in place recycling. And then of course you have full depth reclamation and reconstruction, below that.
Right. And from the standpoint of pavement management, and where these towns start in their overall program, the overall assessment of the network will kind of tell you which direction you can go in. If you're out of a 0 to 100 rating, if you're in, the high 70s or low 80s, you may be able to be heavy on preservation to be able to preserve those roads and keep them in good shape. But if you're starting out in the 60s or even the 50s, you may not have a lot of roads to do preservation on. So the goal here is to get those roads into good condition, prioritize them based on functional classification and all these different metrics out there to be able to help with priorities, and then keep those roads in good condition so that you don't waste the money and throw it out the window. As we talk about those bottom of the curve treatments, Bobby, there's a lot different approach in terms of preparation on those roadways. With the preservation treatments, we talked about making sure that you're selecting the right road at the right time, performing crack sealing beforehand, and making sure that you have a good, clean surface to be able to perform that preservation treatment. What does it look like from the standpoint of the bottom of the curve? What do you need to do to prepare those roadways?
Yeah. So, and I think kind of as Art said, you hit that middle point, and with all the preservation treatments, one of the big things that we talk about is sound structural pavements. So we're now getting to the bottom half of the curve. This is where we're no longer into sound structural pavements. So it does kind of create a bit of a good delineation there, but the prep work changes drastically, and it also, there is a bit in terms of I guess we'll call it urban versus rural, and that type of split. So things like structures become a huge component. So any of these type things, if you're doing mill and fills, then you're going to be working around the structures and having a mill around them. If you're doing cold in place, hot in place, or not so much hot, cold in place or reclamation, you're going to be talking about dropping them, plating them, protecting them in that regard. You start getting into things with what your elevation is. Do you have curbing, driveways? Do you have to do material removal depending on the profile of the road? All of those type things all come into play in terms of your prep. And then you also have to start looking at, instances of what your drainage is. Do you have culverts out there? All of those things become factors that can greatly impact a project and also can impact the cost of a project. doing these things where you got to touch a lot of structures or touch a lot of environmental or water and that type of stuff, it can be huge cost add-ons to just what the treatment cost is.
And I'll just expand on that a little bit, Bobby. The drainage and the sub-base material is a big classification for when you have to go to full depth reclamation. If you have bad base underneath your asphalt, unfortunately, you're going to have to go to that expensive full depth reclamation treatment or reconstruction treatment. And anything above that, your cold in place, your deep mill and fills, shallow mill and fills, hot in place, you're still going to want to make sure you upgrade your drainage if necessary before you take on the cost of doing those treatments in order to get the biggest bang for your buck, the longest service life out of those treatments. And just so everybody understands what we're talking about, the minor rehab with minor mill and fill and hot in place, that's typically down inch and a half, possibly 2 inches. When you go down to deep mill and fill and cold in place recycling, you're talking about 3 to 5.5, 6 inches. And then of course, when you talk full depth reclamation and reconstruction, now you're getting into that sub base and you're improving that sub base and reinstalling your new asphalt on top of that. And just to clarify, sorry, Bobby, clarify, on top of the hot in place and the cold in place, you need a wearing surface on top of both of those treatments, which can include a chip seal. It can include a micro surfacing, hot mix, ultra thin bonded. Any of these wearing surfaces you can put on top of those.
Yeah, and I think another thing kind of along those, and it kind of, as you said, gets into you're working within the layers of mix, on those top treatments, on everything above reclamation, that you're still working with existing mix as far as being left once you get down into them. Whereas with the reclamation, you're down into the underlying gravels. And that's also where, in terms of, you think about it from what you're addressing. So if your cracking is coming all the way up through the entire layer of everything, or if you have inconsistent materials, maybe we talk about New England roads of evolution, where, it started out maybe as an 18-foot road. Now all of a sudden it's 24 or 26 feet wide. And we see those, those outside 3-4 feet looking pretty rough. Those upper treatments aren't going to do much to address those type issues. They're going to address issues with the existing pavement and getting through some of that. So it's the bottom up versus top down in terms of what you have for issues and what treatment you want to get into for selecting.
And then another thing, just with these deep treatments, I don't know if you mentioned it or not, Bobby, but the coring that typically you do to see what you have, quality control is big once you get down to the bottom of the curve here. And so you usually take some cores to see what your thickness of your asphalt is, what the makeup of the asphalt is. Sometimes you have inner layers that you didn't know about that might be there from past years. So it's good to identify those things ahead of a project.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about the different treatments. I think most people out there are familiar with your standard mill and overlay, your 1.5 to 2 inch mill, and they're really familiar with your FDR, even though there's different versions of it, and then your full reconstruction. Why don't we give the viewers a little bit of an overview of what hot in place is and what cold in place is, and we'll provide links below so that they can go and kind of look at each treatment and provide a resource for them to understand what those treatments entail. But Bobby, you want to hit hot in place?
I actually, I'm going to hand it right off to Art. We'll give you all the in places. I'll have a little bit more on the FDR, and elaborate on that. So,
all right. So hot in place. I don't claim to be an expert at hot in place, but I have done the treatment as a past public works director. Typically, you can get down 1.5 inches is pretty much the max you can get down. So it's good for a road if you have a lot of cracks, excessive cracking on a road where going out and crack sealing it is just not feasible. It might be a good option for that. Again, don't forget you have to put something on top of it. So that's something to consider, rural versus urban, roadways. You have to look at, can you raise the elevation of that road? Now, when you get into move down to cold in place, and again, hot in place is a process where they heat up the asphalt. They do it with a series. Typically, it's a series of 3 preheaters, and then the asphalt is milled up, typically put through a rejuvenation process. Materials put right back down, compacted, and then again, your wearing surface on top. Cold in place, much different process. It's actually milled up down to a depth of 5.5 inches. And again, I say 5.5 inches, but that's all asphalt. So if you only have 3 inches of asphalt on the road, and that's typically, the minimum to do a cold in place job. However, you can have 2 inches of asphalt. You just have to add some material on top of that 2 inches of asphalt to be ground in. And again, the mix design is important for those situations. Taking a core from that pavement, sending them out, getting them analyzed, and seeing how much new liquid asphalt to add, how much new filler to add, which is typically a Portland cement. It all gets ground up. It gets rejuvenated with new liquid asphalt. Again, gets put right back down, and a new wearing surface is installed over the top of that.
And Bobby, I'm going to get to you on the FDR in a second, but I want to follow up a question on Art. Art, you know, the one question I get the most on cold in place is, what do I do with my curb reveal? So, you know, we're talking about the difference between rural and urban, and you know, making those selections properly. What do you guys do when there's curbs involved, especially granite curb, where the community's paid a lot of money to install that, and maybe there's even been a couple overlays in that location in the past that has caused the curb reveal to become even less and less from what it was designed to do. What do you guys do for that process?
So first of all, any type of curbing that's there, we just stay right off the curbing. So none of the curbing prevents a cold in place recycling job from happening. The elevation issue is if the road cannot be raised, or if they want the road to be lowered, we can go through and do what's called pre-milling ahead of time. And basically we go down each gutter on the side of the road and we remove material and then recycle the remainder and spread it over the whole width of that lane. And what that ultimately does is lower the elevation of that road to accommodate whatever thickness of wearing surface that you intend to put on top of it. You know, other considerations, obviously driveways. You got to look at driveways as well. Some of these projects may require driveway work. Again, depending on that elevation. The cold in place recycling process by itself, typically you get about a 10% increase in elevation. So you can consider that 10% plus the thickness of whatever wearing surface you're going to put on. And then that's how you determine, you know, what kind of pre-milling, if any, needs to be done. Typically in your rural roads, no pre-milling usually has to be done. They can usually afford to raise the elevation of the road. And quite frankly, those roads, it actually helps it. You know, again, structural component is a big thing with cold in place recycling. We're trying to improve that structural component, and cold in place recycling is an excellent treatment to do that, because we're taking, you know, typically we're taking 1 or 2 layers of asphalt and turning them into one. So there's a big structural benefit in doing that. And then of course, rejuvenating it adds additional structure. And then you're putting a wearing surface on top of that, which leads to an even higher structural value. So a lot of things to consider. We're not going to go into detail too much today, but there's also a bunch of avenues that we can get more detail that Conrad can discuss at the end of the show.
Absolutely. And Bobby, so, you know, we've talked a lot about hot in place and cold in place, and those are obviously treatments in the toolbox. But let's talk about a roadway that is just in extremely poor condition. None of these treatments are the right option, and we're getting into the FDR or the reconstruction. I know people are familiar with the full depth reclamation treatment, but I know that you've been working a lot on additives that you can add into the FDR, and why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, you know, the full depth process, you said, you know, it's been around for a long time, and people are pretty familiar with it. You know, the rotor tiller for the road, we call it. And you're grinding it up. You're going through everything that you've got there. So all your layers of mix, you know, as Art said earlier, it's certainly important to know what you're getting into. You know, especially in some of these rural roads, it's you can get some surprises. All of a sudden, when you pull up a corduroy road, not a corduroy shirt, a corduroy road, and you know, you get, you know, chunks of wood flying up through, or you know, I've even seen where
macadam stones.
Yep, you know, you know, roads that have been down, you get into layers, and all of a sudden you can smell it after, you know, 30, 40 years of what's been down underneath there. So these layers are very interesting sometimes, but you're going to go through all of that and then get down into the underlying gravel. So you're really what we call breaking the crack pattern. You're going to get a consistent mix across the entire road. So if you do have one of those roads of evolution, or if you have patches, if you have, you know, maybe you've had to do some full depth patches at times or any of that, you're going to blend all that together and get consistency. With the additives or the stabilizing agents, really is what they are. You know, there's really, for around here, two to three main uses. You know, the first being either a calcium or a mag chloride. For the most part around here, it's calcium chloride that gets added in, helping to bind together that material. That typically, you know, in terms of all these, the process is you do your normal reclaim, you grade it, you compact it, you get it to pretty much a finished product. And then you go back through with calcium, you would spray it out on top, run the reclaimer over it, and fluff it into that top layer. That's kind of the first option. Some places they'll do nothing. Some places it's, grind grade compact, off you go. Once you get beyond the calcium, you can look at really two options. The first is asphalt emulsion, the second being cement. There is some cement stabilization done here in New England. Not a lot, not as much as we see in some of the southern and western climates, but there is some. The emulsion or asphalt emulsion stabilization is really the more common one that we've seen around here, and it's been around for quite some time. But essentially, once you get through that first part of the process, you then hook up a tanker up to the reclaimer, and right through the drum, you actually inject the asphalt emulsion and grind that in to typically the top 4.5 inches, and get that solid layer, similar to what Art was talking about with the cold in place. You get that top 4.5 inches that is a bound product that's solid, that it cures out, it firms up, it can be cored, it becomes a solid bound bituminous product, and that's what then you pave on top of. So you get that structural bump on top of what you would normally get. And it takes into account all those considerations of what type of road it is and what you're going to have for future traffic and all of those type things.
And I think we talked a little bit about the tools in the toolbox and making sure that you're selecting the right treatment for the right situation. How does the rural versus urban component come into it? I personally live in the burbs, and I don't really want a reclaimer coming down my street unless it's absolutely necessary. So how does the rural versus urban component come into just selecting which treatments are viable for a certain roadway?
I mean, I guess I'll kind of start with it. It's certainly absolutely a consideration. The first being what you have for the roads, what your structure counts are, as much as, we talk about, and it can be top of the curve, it can be bottom of the curve, right road, right treatment, right time. There's also other considerations that come into play, and it's, costing is certainly an issue. And if you've got a lot of iron on a road, it really can be not feasible for trying to put a reclaimer in there, and potentially even with the cold in place, it can be an issue. So that's always a consideration. Then you get into things with, what the shape of the road is. Is it tight quarters? Is it where you don't have a lot of room to turn? And those type things come into play. And some of these, we call them trains, the equipment trains, that can be an issue in terms of what's out there. And then getting into things like, if you're into high traffic areas, having a road that, with reclaim, you're going to have a time period where it's going to be ground up. There's going to be a period of time where you're essentially going to be on a gravel road. So that's certainly a factor that comes into play. And then the last one being, and Art hit on a little bit before, is also, the curb reveal, or, what you have for driveways and what you're going to be adding for elevation. And similar to a cold in place, there are times where reclaims are done and there's material removed. But certainly, again, that adds cost to a project. So all of that kind of comes into play. And Art, I'm sure you've got some other thoughts or some additional that I'm probably missing, I bet.
Well, and again, what I like to try to think of, and what Conrad, what you said about full depth, you don't want to see a reclaimer coming down your street. I think going back and looking at, we're all taxpayers, looking at equivalent annual cost and what it's going to cost you to do what type of treatment. And if that same road that you just talked about, for example, let's say had real bad base, it needed to be stabilized, it needed to be improved, I just don't think you'd be doing yourself a big disservice by eliminating the correct treatment and going with a lesser treatment on that specific road. So I just think it's so important for pavement managers to keep that in mind. Mill and fill, it absolutely has its place. It just shouldn't be sacrificed for the proper treatment. And to me, that's the biggest issue I see when I talk to pavement managers, in my territory, is that right there. There's so much pressure on them, and they end up doing a lesser, I'll call it a Band-Aid treatment. I can't tell you the people that have done a shallow mill and fill on a project called me to say, come out and look at it. And they're disappointed that a year or two later, it has basically every distress that was in that underneath that 1.5 inch mill and fill is right back up through it. That said, shallow mill and fill has its place. They're just dragging it too far down the curve. So I think if we can get people really start thinking about equivalent annual cost and what it's costing over the life of the treatment, I think decisions will be made that'll give them a much longer treatment, a longer life of the treatment.
Right. And when I say I don't want to see a reclaimer roll down my street, I'm hoping my community preserves the roads well enough that it never gets in that state. So that's our whole promotion here, is to get ahead of things and start thinking ahead. Right. All right. Well, I think this was another great episode. A lot of good information put out to our listeners. And make sure you check out below. We're going to put a bunch of resources in terms of links to all the different treatments that we talked about today, especially the hot in place and the cold in place and the FDR additives. And we'll see you next time on New England Road Talk.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good one.